Thank you, Dr. Rakau, again about this video. Baruch Hashem. We're going to try to explain a little bit something this week that's a little bit different than the standard. So this week's Parshas, two Parshas. One is Parshas Mattos, Parshas Masie. Parshas Masie is the journeys that the Jewish people took until they reached their goal, whatever their goal is, obviously to go to Israel, whatever it is. But the point is that we know the Torah doesn't record something that's not important. That means we don't really know every conversation that ever happened in history of the time in the Midbar. We don't have every conversation. The things that were recorded, that because the Torah is teaching us that this is an important lesson for us. So the question is, there were certain stops in the way that weren't necessarily successful stops. Like there were certain stops that were considered that they weren't, such great people at those stops. They had one stop that they did the Egel. They had different stops that they did different things, and not every stop was that necessarily successful. So why does the Torah go through all 40 stops? Because there are 40 stops on the way to Eretz Yisrael. So the answer to that is obviously almost self-explanatory, but I think it's a life lesson for all of us. The lesson for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people, is that first of all, every stop of the way that the Jewish people took was important. That means that sometimes the hardest concept for a growing person to learn is the concept that growth doesn't always work in one direction. That means like this. Sometimes, for the first time a kid watches a construction project, so they see, let's say they're doing a revamp on a house or whatever they call that. So you see a house there one time, an old decrepit house, broken down house. And now what they see is that now the question is, a couple weeks later, a kid walks by and he sees now they're bringing big trucks and they're banging down the house. And then now it's broken down. They should start building. That doesn't happen. They start digging deep down. And when they dig deep down, then they sometimes find stuff and they have to dig deeper. And other things here in Phoenix, they have to dig a thing to catch the water, something deep to catch the water. Different places you have different rules, but the idea is the concept is the same. When you build something, it's not always forward building. I mean, sometimes you have to dig deep, and sometimes you have to step backwards. Sometimes it's built on different things. Like, and someone said to me, he said, my positive personalities came from X, Y, and Z. And I said to him, your positive personalities came from X, Y, and Z, and negative X, Y, and Z. What does that mean? That means that everything that we do and have comes from our positive side and our negative side. Without our negative side, we wouldn't have a positive side either. That's not who we are. It's impossible to have a positive side if you don't have a negative side. The same thing here. The Jewish people, the growth of the Jewish people happened only because they had a negative side too. If they had no negative side, they wouldn't have had a positive side. They wouldn't have been able to grow the way they did to be able to make it all the way to the land of Israel. So we're going to go a step further. The same thing is with each of us, because the same way Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, is a whole, is us as a whole, we also have us as ourself, as the Jewish people as a whole. So every one of us grows. We grow. Our whole life, that's our goal in life, is to grow some more, to be more spiritual, to be more successful, and spiritual, etc., etc. That's our whole life. That's the goal, to be closer to God and to be closer to more loving, more helpful, more happy. But that doesn't happen one step. That means that every day we're working on it. Sometimes you have to take steps back and say, and sometimes what happens, God forbid, somebody sins. That's a step backwards. But the other hand is, he has to continue forward from that point. He can't make that stop. He could say, that's part of my growth for me to be successful, and continue back to where he was up to, and continue work higher and higher. And that's what the Torah is teaching us in the journeys. It's teaching us that just like the Jewish people had 40 stops on the way to the land of Israel, a human being has 40 stops on his way to his successes, which is a great thing. We think that, we look at ourselves 6 months, a year from now, and we say, I grew a little bit, I grew a drop, I did this, X, Y, or I did X, or I did Y, or I did Z. It's only one step. We have 40 steps, 40 things that we have to do until we hit a success. And the Rashiva, I once heard the Rashiva say over, Rabbi Ruvain Feinstein, he once said over, he said, when you do a good deed, when you do something, you want it to become part of you, you have to do it for 40 days. And when you do something for 40 days, it becomes part of you. And I think this is coming from the same concept. Because the same thing, steps upwards is also one thing, but steps of making something stronger is one thing too. For instance, let's say somebody is knocking in a nail. So you're knocking a nail once, twice. But if you're knocking a nail 40 times, now it's really there. So I'm not saying a nail has to be knocked in 40 times. I'm not a builder, clearly. If anybody knows building, they know a lot better than me. But the idea is that 40 times makes something solid. So the fact that the Jewish people traveled in 40 different places, that made us a traveling people. That means that the question is like this. After we got to Eretz Yisrael, what happens? We get thrown out into Galus, we get sent away. But the success that we have is built in Galus, in exile, is built on the fact that they took 40 steps in exile to hit success. That means that they already gave us the possibility to be successful as an exiled nation. There are many nations out there that haven't been successful in exile. A lot of nations have been successful when they're living in their place. The Jewish people have been successful as a nation living in Israel, in its place, in our place. And at the same time, they've been successful in exile. Where did that success come from? So this is where the success comes from. It comes from this week's Parsha, from this week's Torah portion. So we have to know that everything that we do as a Jew comes from the generations before. Everything that all our successes comes from the past. And through that, obviously, we can grow and see clearly to move forward. Hashem should bless us all. We should all have a blessed Shabbos, and we should all grow and see the growth and have all the potential that it's possible for us to have to be successful. Good Shabbos, everybody.